since I did the talk on Buddha at the gas pump on the dangers of Neo-Advaita and how to recover, I've gotten probably definitely over 100 emails. And then I've had a lot of different conversations with people online. And a lot of them talk about like issues and disturbances that they've had with their families after going down or following self-negating non-dual teachings and going through self-deconstructive ego dissolution type paths. And yeah, the theme has generally been that people have found it really difficult to connect with their family members. A lot of times it's about their children having difficulty not just connecting with them or feeling empathy for them, but also having difficulty just functioning in the role, the responsibility carrying role as a mom or a dad, and also questioning whether they could actually stay within their families because of the shifts that they're having. And I would say that like one of the things that a lot of people point to is like that they start to see, because they're following teachings that are making them shift towards seeing other people as just illusions or just like dream characters that aren't really real, that it has like a really like profound effect on like their sense of, even just it can lead to a lot of nihilism and like a loss of like meaning and motivation to engage with other people, and in this case kids and family members, because it starts to feel like they're not really real anyway, kind of thing. I can read you just a few quotes that I got in emails that people said was okay to share if you want.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so one of the first ones that I got was from a dad, and I'll read the whole thing, and if you want to cut some of it out later, you can. But he wrote, I could have these deep, no self, no doer, pure awareness type experiences where I'd even let go of the one that wants to say, yeah, I've got it. But every time it was like Robert had to come back eventually to be able to relate to my family. I just couldn't stay as pure awareness at the same time. Pure spacious awareness without somehow being detached from my family's struggles or pain. It felt like there was this choice to stay with my family emotionally and physically or leave them permanently, like many of these enlightened folks seem to do. The Buddha did that as well. All the teachings said it was possible to stay physically, but not keep being so affected by all the drama of family life. But for me, this just seemed impossible. I just couldn't have the empathy my family needed and keep the personal Robert at arm's length. It was like I could feel the moment Robert would grab the reins again. Again, I'd practice and inspire to let go of him, and hopefully one day forever. It was like permanently being at war with a non-existent person who just feels so real. It was exhausting. It became the source of most of my suffering in the end, on top of the usual suffering of normal life. And I couldn't stop being me and also be a dad and a husband. So that's one
That's
that I thought was pretty
such a
powerful.
sad story. Yeah. Did you talk to him in person?
Yeah, we became friends, and he actually met him through Tim's group, the ICU. And then we connected and we met at one of his retreats, which seems to be a theme now.
That's cool. Is he fine now? Did he leave the
He's definitely
teachings
gotten
behind?
out of the Neo-Advaita stuff, but I'm not sure where he's at right now, but he did leave all of that behind eventually.
Yeah.
Do you want me to go to another one? Or things to talk about with that one? I think this one is just really showing the questions about compatibility
Yeah.
with, so there's a term in like the Eastern world, householder, maybe you've heard of it, versus a renunciate, like somebody who becomes a monk or goes to a monastery on their enlightenment seeking path, or in more past generations, you'd have the wandering renunciate who would leave society or leave their families and their jobs, and they would just wander around asking, living off of like donations of food and things from people. So that's usually what we think of, and what traditionally a lot of these, mostly like Enlightenment teachings and the ego dissolution teachings, that those were generally followed by people who were committed to renouncing their worldly life or their householder life. And so there was like less issues of compatibility because they no longer had their normal responsibilities and relationships that they were big parts of. And now, of course, with decontextualizing and creating like the instant enlightenment path in the West and the Neo-Advaita, like the direct path, basically like stripping away all of those traditional contexts, it's being positioned pretty much as this is for everyone. You can, like he said, people saying, yeah, just do this as a dad and you'll just be more detached from the suffering, but everything will be fine. And for a great number of people, everything is not fine.
Yeah. I wonder why it's always portrayed as nothing changes in the end. You can do all this worldly stuff like everyone else, but just better than before. But
yeah,
how can this be possible for everyone, especially if you lose your sense of self? This definitely does something to the feeling with everything.
I think there's probably a few things there. There's always, I think there are people that somehow like they become more detached from their sense of self, and maybe because their sense of self was like really troubled and getting in the way of things, that like at least temporarily or in the beginning, maybe it stops rumination and other things that were making it hard to function. And so they're finding that some things maybe become easier, they take things less seriously. But I also think a big part of it is that a lot of the people who are promoting these paths in the West are often not people that have families. They're often not people that are working in high functioning jobs. And a lot of times they appear to be somebody who's single, or they might be somebody who's, there's all of these young, like teenager and young 20s people teaching stuff like Neo-Advaita and radical non-duality, people that also don't have families and those sorts of responsibilities. So I think there's like a kind of, a lot of people can be very naive to think that, yeah, like it's not going to matter. You can find a way to make it compatible without knowing, because they don't know from experience. Then also I think it's very much like traditionally like a man's path or like a male path. And I think it's interesting to think about what responsibilities they had in comparison to what the woman had. Especially traditionally, it was much more normal for the dad to just be more detached and not as much involved in raising the kids and things like that. So there's a great number of women today and moms who are attempting to do this. So
Yeah, all great points.
yeah.
So yeah, maybe share another story.
Okay. So let's see which one I'll tell. Maybe I'll tell this one. This is like one of the most tragic emails that I got. And this is a woman who is like a older middle-aged woman, and she shared with me that her son committed suicide, and he was a father, like a young father of little kids. He was married. And she was clear that he did have mental health issues before he got into Neo-Advaita, and he got really into Eckhart Tolle and some of the radical non-duality stuff. I can't remember the name of the teacher that she mentioned that he was really treating as his guru, but it was a really hardcore, like, derealization set of teachings, and very much on everybody's an illusion and kind of this sense of everyone's just a projection in your own awareness or consciousness. And she said that when he killed himself, I think like he left a note behind, and he had been saying that I know that when I kill myself now, that my family is going to stop existing too, because they're merely illusions that are constructs of my mind. And some people might say that, well, then he misunderstood the teachings, but it really doesn't matter, because it's not necessarily if somebody messes up what the philosophy is saying. It's more so that this is the effect that these teachings have on a great number of people, that you start to see reality that way.
Yeah. Many
and-
people get psychosis
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
of this. And then you can
Yeah.
also say they misunderstood the teaching. No, the teaching did something with them.
Yeah, and if it's radical non-duality, then a lot of it is literally saying that nothing exists, and in this really hardcore way. And so she then also mentioned that she ended up reaching out to one of his radical non-duality teachers, and he was just extremely apathetic and was like, if you're upset about this, maybe you need to follow the teachings too, because there's that whole narrative that nobody died because he never existed kind of thing.
Wow.
So-
wow.
Yeah. And so it's interesting, because in that case, I think maybe what it's pointing to is that some people maybe have struggled with not wanting to live anymore. And then once they start to see the world as less real and other people as less real, it may give them a sense of comfort that, like, because a lot of people don't go through with it because of guilt and they don't want to hurt their family. So that now, perhaps in some cases, they're not really real anyway, so it's okay to kill myself. Is maybe something that happens too. But even though I've gotten only a few messages about people that have actually killed themselves, though I do get plenty and hear a lot about this, many people report becoming suicidal or wanting to die because of the way that it, makes them feel completely meaningless and nihilistic and dysfunctional and depersonalized and all those different things.
Yeah. Suicide is another topic, but I think you don't hear from the people killing themselves. I think there are a lot more, and you just don't know it because nobody tells you.
Absolutely. And a lot of times I'm sure people kill themselves and their loved ones don't know that they had been involved in these major shifts in the way that they relate to reality as less real or unreal, and trying to erase themselves and going through a lot of madness around that.
Wow, the woman which you talked to, the mother, I can imagine that she must be really angry.
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
my mother would be, I think she would have fantasies about killing these gurus.
Maybe she did, but they're already dead. They don't exist anyway, right?
Yeah.
I think she did mention also that her son had been talking to that teacher about being suicidal, and that what a lot of them do, and I think she mentioned that this one did also, was like, you just need to further understand and realize that nothing really exists. The whole kind of who's the one who wants to kill themselves, just realize they don't exist. You and I talked about that before. Rather than thinking that there's something that needs a different kind of intervention or in that. So I have another one that's also pretty intense, if you want to hear about it. I know it's quite depressing, but
and it's really
important. It's important for people to understand.
And crazy at the same time. Every time we talk and we share stories, I think it's
I know.
So, but,
It's very overwhelming, but the
yeah,
more we spread awareness about it, the less people will have these experiences.
I hope so. Yeah.
I hope so too. So this one, a woman emailed me and she mentioned a specific teacher, and I think it's fine to mention him, and it's not, he's just an example of many people who are in that fear. But so she said that, and this is someone who ended up reaching out to Willoughby Britton also. So she said, I had committed to quote unquote forsake everything in order to find truth. At the beginning of my journey, I was assured by my spiritual teacher, Stephen Bodian, that everything I lost would be given back to me. And she said, not true. I lost custody of my children when they were 8 and 4, and I never got them back in my care. I didn't consider for 1 minute that I would have to sacrifice them. If I had known, I would never have committed to that spiritual journey. I made my decision right then and there to stop with all of the non-duality stuff and return to my children in every sense of the word. And my life has been infinitely better ever since. Enlightenment was sold as the answer to all suffering. I reject that wholeheartedly. Some will say that I didn't go far enough to reach a state of true freedom. I don't believe them, and I don't give a shit what they think. This one's obviously very extreme, but I've heard this more than once around people either losing custody or their partners feeling as though they're not capable of being responsible for the kids being the primary.
Is this the reason why they lose custody for their children?
So in this situation, the reason why she lost custody was because she ended up having a psychotic break after following all of these teachings. And again, we don't know. Maybe she had those before, maybe not. But again, I don't think that matters because it was the teachings and the shifts that they led to, which was also seeing that like other people can't be verified as real outside your mind and everything's an illusion and blah blah blah. That triggered the series of events that led to that break with reality. And so because of that episode, it freaked out the husband, who then argued to have them taken out of her care.
Yeah.
And so the fact that she's saying, the teacher said, which they often say, is that this will take everything from you. Do you want it bad enough to lose everything? But they don't generally say what everything entails. It's like very vague, and maybe people think just what they're saying is you lose your sense of self and identity, but not that there's a potential risk that you might lose your job or lose your children or things like that as like a fallout of these things, even if it's just in a temporary breakdown that you have after reality is shattering around you. So I think that, what all of it points to is, I think, like something relatively simple and that should be easy to do, which is like, to not dismiss the real questions around compatibility for people being a needing to be like a highly functional responsibility caregiver while also going through a process of shattering their entire sense of self and reality and agency and all those things. And then also to very fully disclose what are known to be repercussions of going down these extreme paths, that they're not something to just take casually. Like a lot of the narrative is, don't wait, don't hesitate, what are you waiting for, don't you want freedom now, kind of thing. And that whole kind of like direct path movement, which that teacher Stephen that she mentioned describes himself as teaching.
Wasn't she the teacher of Susan Siegel?
Yes,
Yeah,
he
yeah,
was.
yeah. Okay.
And what was I saying? Oh, the direct path, especially today, what they describe as like a selling point is you don't need years of preparation like people traditionally did. You don't need to do years of meditation or cultivating like a regulated inner state, things like that, that this is just something that you can do and should do instantly. And while maybe that there's a difference between like preparations, like spiritual practices and things like that, and then there's just practical preparation of being prepared for what could happen in the fallout. If there were to be more disclosure around this, can be especially challenging and risky for people that have young children, or you have a specific kind of job that you need to support your livelihood, that there's a fallout period that's at least temporary, though for a lot of people it's long term, where the disturbances to your sense of self and reality and all of those things can make you either dysfunctional for a period of time or losing all motivation and ability to stay in these roles. Like that, all of these things should be presented from the beginning as possibilities.
Yeah.
And that gives somebody informed consent when all you're being told is like all the peace and freedom and everlasting joy and bliss or whatever it is, but there's no mention of any of the potential downsides besides things like you're going to lose yourself, but all these things that aren't real anyway, kind of thing. And then are you strong enough, kind of thing, where there's more of a judgment and pressure dynamic rather than like from a place of like ethics and just kindness to be like, yeah, these things can fall away in a way that can have really big, important impact that you should consider and be prepared for the possibility of, and not push it again as something that you should just casually jump into. And I think it also, the biggest thing that I feel like I advocate for is to stop teaching these extreme Eastern paths like indiscriminately. And I think if people stop doing that, then obviously if people stop doing that on YouTube to the general public, including teenagers and young people and people with intense trauma and psychological issues, and not that's the only people that are at risk of being harmed, not at all.
Yeah, that's one problem too. I wanted to say this as when you told the story of the young man, the father who killed himself, then people will come and say, yeah, he had problems before. So maybe he had killed himself even if he wasn't in touch with these teachings, because he had problems beforehand.
But what he disclosed pretty clearly was that like seeing his family as unreal or less than real gave him the more motivation to kill himself, because he believed that he wouldn't be abandoning them because they would disappear anyway.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really matter, because the whole point is, if people are claiming that people who have pre-existing mental health conditions are more likely to be harmed, then it just points all the more to why there has to be full disclosure. If there's a population of people that you know are more vulnerable, then that points to ethical responsibility to make that known. There's tons of things where, it's disclosed that people with a history of trauma or psychosis or mental health issues should be careful around engaging with this or with taking these pills or psychedelics and things like that. But again, and this is probably a topic for another discussion, by no means is it just that demographic of people that are at risk of experiencing these really intense and often like adverse impact just from the nature of how extreme a radical shattering of your sense of self and reality is.
Yeah.
And it's always been talked about that way in the traditions themselves. It's just not being discussed today.
Yeah, and I know this is also another topic, but all the teachers themselves
Sorry, one second.
Okay. The teachers often, if they were, because of blah, my English today is not the best. The teachers often have a history of mental problems.
That's important to say too, that at least 3 or 4 of the teachers I followed were suicidal right before their big awakening and were promoting it as the solution. Or you'll hear a lot of maybe more of the Neo-Advaita radical non-duality people will tell people who say they're suicidal that the answer is not to kill your body, but to kill yourself metaphorically and go through an ego death. So they're actually prescribing it to people with mental health issues as a solution. So that brings in a lot of complexity there. But the other thing is that a lot of these teachers describe themselves having these really intense, debilitating effects. I was just writing a blog post yesterday about memory impairment and people having decline in their memory recall and things like that after going down these kind of self-shattering paths. And I experienced that myself at a certain point on that path. And a guy in a satsang transcript was telling the teacher, it's really frustrating me, the issues with memory that are coming up. And she's like, oh, I totally experienced that. I still experience that today. And it's like decades after her initial awakening. And she's, I was wandering around my hotel room at the retreat and I couldn't find my hotel room for 30 minutes because I had no idea where it was and things like that. And a lot of them are honest that these aren't due to like people making a mistake or things like that, that they're these things, a lot of these things are more features of the changes that you go through rather than it being a bug. And that doesn't get shown enough either. And it's not, teachers don't talk about it consistently. It's often like after somebody's already gone through with a really dramatic change like this, that then they're like, oh yeah, memory loss, a loss of empathy. I had to leave my family because I couldn't take care of my kids, like afterwards, where it's like, a lot of people would have really liked to know that beforehand to be able to consider if they wanted to do this at this point in life, for example. There's that. And then there's also research that's been coming out around people who have had so-called like abiding, like no self type of awakenings that have been lasting, are experiencing things years later, like memory impairment, loss of empathy, dissociation, relationship breakdown, and things like that. So it's really important that people understand that.
Before I want to go in this direction of that these teachings shouldn't be told to the general public and that it has to be like it was before the internet, that you just, if you want to teach this, then really just to a special kind of people maybe. I don't know how in India for I don't know how many years they did this. When did they know if someone was ready for the teaching?
Yeah.
I think it was a long process. And I also think you had this householder thing in everyone's life, so that a husband, I think, goes through this period of householding and then is ready to move into a more spiritual
Yeah.
direction.
A lot of times you can hear and read like the suggestions in a lot of these traditions where it's like this would be most appropriate for a late stage in life,
Yeah.
after the kids are gone,
Yeah.
after you've retired, things like that. And I think it's because of the fact that it can disrupt that life and those responsibilities. But I think so. One of the things, like to answer that question that you were saying, is, you know, that in the traditions, they weren't going out and advertising enlightenment, right? You didn't have them going out in the streets and saying, "Enlightenment now, come over to my ashram or my house, and I'm going to help you shatter your sense of self and be free forever." No, it was people sought it out themselves. And so a lot of people talk about how now in the West, it's become something that's marketed.
Yeah, it
And
is.
that can be very lucrative for people to set themselves up this way and get students and a lot of things that people pay them for. And so it's in some ways you could see it as like marketing, that people are going out and advertising it, rather than if there were these teachers that existed and people who already had found on their own this idea of wanting to pursue these sorts of paths would then out by word of mouth or even the internet, Advaita Vedanta teacher or Tibetan Buddhist teacher, whatever it is, so that it would be more of a niche of people might seek it out, rather than it being like marketed to them all over YouTube and best-selling books as this is what you need and what everybody needs to do now. And the other thing was like, how did they know who was ready or not ready? Is, for example, like I was saying before, in Hindu traditions, there was a preparatory path for that was pretty standard. And one of the things was that people were needing to cultivate over time through practices and lifestyle changes inner regulation, so that today so many of us are like, we don't have inner regulation. And the teachings are presented as the way to get regulated, where in the past it was be regulated first, so that before you go and shatter your sense of self, you've got a more baseline of being regulated where you'd be more likely to stay regulated, maybe is the idea. And then that path would also make somebody more prepared, because they're gradually maybe going through these shifts in self and reality, but then they also have a greater time period with which to like really know what they're getting into, kind of thing, rather than just, oh, this sounds great, freedom forever, follow a pointer, fuck, I don't exist anymore, and things like that. And then the other thing, and I'm not endorsing people like Ramana Maharshi, Nisargadatta necessarily, but there's quotes from them that say, there's no one teaching for everyone. The teaching I give is specific to the person based on whatever it is that they assessed about that particular person in dialogue with them. So
Yeah.
I think one of the major things today is that there's that great lack of a personal relationship and assessment. I'm really in favor of any types of radically consciousness, self, and reality altering, whether they're pointers or teachings or practices, just like psychedelics have ethical protocols that are safeguards, where there is an assessment period. Like when I talk to psychedelic facilitators, they're like pretty shocked that about the whole sort of Neo-Advaita stuff, and the fact that people who come in depersonalized are then told, yeah, just go through ego death or have these ego death experiences. And in the psychedelic protocols, where psychedelics are often one way that people seek out ego death experiences and ego dissolution, and people facilitate it. I think in the same way that these non-dual teachers facilitate it with these pointers and practices and stuff, that there be some assessment and an understanding among them of basic human psychology and spiritual emergency and trauma and things, and to have some criteria like they have in psychedelic research and understandings, that like if somebody's very destabilized and ungrounded, that wouldn't be a time that you would give them a substance that would further destabilize and unground them, because it can be dangerous.
Yeah.
And so there would be a one-to-one assessment period. Then you'd have the preparation stage, which, like I said, could simply be a full disclosure of the repercussions. You need to understand that before you fully consent to going through this process. And then not most importantly, but importantly, then readily accessible support for integration of the fallout. So you don't have these people shattering their sense of self through a YouTube video, then having no one to talk to, having no idea what's going on in the fallout, and not knowing where to turn to get support for that. I feel like it's a no-brainer in a way, and there's lots of pushback that people will give. It's just the truth, and we shouldn't shut down the truth or make it harder to get to the truth, and it's not for the faint of heart, and blah 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 blah. But it's, people could say that psychedelics lead to the truth, so nobody should be pushed out of psychedelics. But that whole community realizes that there's an ethical imperative to consider safeguards to have in place, so that if this is something that the people want to seek out, or that people think can be helpful to people, that they do it in a way where they're trying to solve suffering, where they're not doing things that are very clearly likely to put people in greater risk of harm without any of those safeguards in place.
Yep.
It's also a question of kindness and compassion.
Yes, it is. But it's also another topic. But these people, and also not just the teachers, but the followers also, it feels like they don't have compassion anymore at all. I made a video about why I am making videos because people don't understand what I am doing. And so I told them again that I just want to share my experience with non-duality, and also to talk about the potential dangers, because nobody does this. And I also showed some emails I got from people where I was helpful for them, and so on. And still people are coming to my comment section and write, you just didn't get it, blah blah blah. And I saw that these people are not able to just in one sentence write something like, hey, sorry that this happened to all these people, that's really bad, but maybe blah, but you didn't get it. This would be also
there's no concern or any show of fear.
Yes
Compassion.
Yes, it's you can tell stories like this with the suicidal, or the man who killed himself, and they will still just say, he didn't get it. It's sad.
I think that in some cases there are people that are just assholes, and we also know that the scene of the gurus tends to bring in a lot of narcissistic characters, even potentially borderline sociopath type people. Obviously not all of them, but it's understandable that a lot of people that are narcissistic go into those types of positions of power. But I think it's also, considering that people want this to be the holy grail that's the answer to all suffering, and they're very invested in that, I think there's a lot of defensiveness and cognitive dissonance and denial that they want to believe that, it's very rare and it's inadequacies on people's part, when it's you and I both went down these paths and we did have the intended shifts. And like we said before, people who we see as awakened and who claim to be awakened and who are looked at as authority figures are describing that they experienced these side effects, that they had a year or less or more of extreme dysfunction as their everything was falling apart in front of them. Then they talk about how years later they have things like memory impairment or difficulty having empathy for people, losing sex drive, all these sorts of things that are, again, like features, not bugs, of actually succeeding. So I think in some ways, it's the more that somebody does get it, potentially the more likely they are to experience some of these common featured downsides and impairments.
Yeah.
So it's, yeah.
And maybe that's the point where people decide to leave this whole stuff behind or go further down the road, because I don't know why they do it, because they also have some positive side effects from it.
Yeah, or
Maybe.
they're willing to take the chance and the risks. Some people choose that, but I think there obviously has to be a much greater understanding beforehand of like the risk reward ratio that people can decide for themselves
Yeah, so true.
and not be pressured or have those things downplayed or things like that.
Yeah.
Like I can also maybe just read one other thing.
Yeah, back to the topic, please.
Well, it's not a letter from somebody. It's actually, so I think it's, you say Dogchen. I thought it was Dogchen, but it's one of the methods, like of a direct method of cutting through one sense of self from within Tibetan Buddhism. And that's something that's indiscriminately promoted everywhere from YouTube to best-selling books to Sam Harris's Waking Up app that goes to millions of people in general public. And it's very rare that you will hear a guru or a teacher actually put disclosures or warnings. And I did find one that is just a great example of, imagine if everybody did this. So she wrote on her website, she said, on this website, there are two kinds of teachings: public teachings and then Dogchen and Mahamudra. Before diving in headfirst, please understand the differences in risks associated with each. And this is a Tibetan Lama, and she wrote, on these swift paths, which are like these direct, instant enlightenment paths, there are more risks and pitfalls to the student. There can be inner upheavals, wacky experiences, and extreme highs and lows. This practice is not for everyone. Please take it into consideration if you have a history of mental health issues or are experiencing significant emotional distress. She said, if the Mahayana path is like hiking a trail up a mountain, Dogchen is like climbing a sheer rock wall. It's a direct route with many more pitfalls. Things can go wrong. And that's a pretty clear and a pretty ethical and kind, but there's so many people teaching this stuff with none of that whatsoever and presenting it as a solution for the things that she's saying would be criteria for you being at greater risk.
Yeah.
So
She's a great example of someone who does it right, I think.
yeah, and then I'll just read one more about self-inquiry, because that's so much of what the non-dual and Neo-Advaita teachings are based around, is the self-inquiry of who am I to, yeah, radically dissolve or become, perceive a non-existence of self. And not everybody's gonna agree with what he says, though I do. And he says that self-inquiry is considered an advanced practice. And this is like he's a yoga teacher, but also does teach self-inquiry in certain cases. Said this is considered an advanced practice and would be contraindicated for people with a history of mental disease or emotional instability. And somebody wrote on it as a comment something like, how could you say that? It can help people, and it's this is the truth, we shouldn't keep it from anyone. And he said, listen, encouraging people in these people that are in already in ungrounded or destabilized states, encouraging them to experience these rapid sort of shifts into other realms of reality can be destabilizing, and in many cases make the condition worse, when what they need is to solidify their reality right now and their emotions, and to diminish their experience with fluctuating states of reality and emotions. And I think a lot of this is based on research, and also the very same is what psychedelic ethical protocols are in place for. So
Yeah.
there are examples of this that could be followed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can't add anything because it's just, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's a good place to end off with, because in some ways that's like an optimistic note that there are some people who are doing that in a more ethical and responsible way that could be an example to be followed by people who care about ethics and people who have compassion. Of course, not all of them want to, and there's a lot of reasons why some people wouldn't want to do that, because they'll maybe get less followers or get less money. And I'm not saying that's the majority of teachers, though I know that many are in that bucket of people.
Yeah. I think I will talk about this in another video. I think it's
Mhm.
important.
Sorry, 1 second.
Yeah. Back to the family topic. Do you have another story for me? No?
Those are all of them.
Really?
Uh-huh.
You told me.
Those are the ones that I have like quotes for, and like a full story. Like I've
Okay.
listened to other people
Okay.
where they've mentioned like difficulty empathizing with kids and things like that. But those were like the main three that are like a full story with quotes and things like
Okay,
that.
okay, okay. Yeah.
You'll find this stuff all over the internet. You'll see it in YouTube comments on Neo-Advaita videos. You'll see it in public forums, things like that,
Yeah.
Reddit, etc.
I didn't find much on Reddit. Maybe I had the wrong words.
Like when I
Search
come
words.
across them again, I'll share them with you.
Yeah, please.
Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I do have one more.
Okay. The
So
more stories, the better.
this is from a woman who actually was doing some research that was showing people with lasting sort of loss of self in the non-duality context were experiencing things like empathy reduction, memory issues, dissociation, etc. She said that I'm experiencing a lot of positive things from this identity loss, but when I'm being honest with myself, I am having memory issues and I'm having issues with empathy. And I have two daughters, and I noticed that with them, and I'm not sure yet what this one's a bit more vague. Like I'm not sure yet what the implications are going to be of this, but she did say I have to pretend to be the person that I was before, even though she doesn't exist anymore, and things like that. But so that's not an extreme one, but she was asking questions to herself around like, how is this going to work? And is this going to impair my relationship with my girls because I'm having difficulty with, attuning to other people's emotions and having empathy for them and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you don't have children, but if you had children while you had your problems, so to say,
Yeah.
I think it would be difficult for you too.
What I noticed for myself is I visit my niece and nephews a lot, and they were young back then, like 4 and 7. And I just remember that as I was going deeper and deeper into this kind of this ego dissolution process, I was really becoming socially impaired because I was losing motivation to engage in like play and laughter. I lost a lot of my sense of laughing at things that were, like worldly, and playing games. Like none of this stuff mattered anymore. And I felt like silliness wasn't just coming naturally anymore. There was nothing to say anymore. I just wanted to be in silence and things like that. And it made it difficult for me to be like an enthusiastically engaged aunt. And I
Mm.
started to feel like something's wrong here.
Yeah.
There's this real hollowness and emptiness, even though I was having personal serenity and things like that, that I very much wanted and valued. But I was starting to see the way that it was negatively impacting like the richness of relationships and things like that. And it
Yeah.
just seemed, wait a minute, like this isn't something desirable, and that's something that's sad. And if I want to have kids, like how am I gonna be immersed in the play and the care and the empathy and the motivation, have fun with them and things like that.
Yeah, that's also a great example. Mm. I also lost my ability to connect with people.
Yeah.
And I still have sometimes that it feels like my emotions were deeper back then before this whole shit happened. You know? The feeling of connection or of love and empathy and all these feelings were really richer.
Yeah.
Everything is still like a little
Dull.
pressed. Yeah, dull. That's the right word. Yeah.
I hope it only increases to come back.
Yeah, I think so. And it's great. Sometimes I have these moments where it feels like before, and that's so great. These are such beautiful moments where you realize how wonderful it is to have a normal human experience.
Like fully human,
Yeah.
which includes personal, having a personality. And
Yeah.
I'm going to say one more thing that I often hear from people, and I really understand it, is that as they lose their sense of identity and their sense of self, and really find themselves having challenges relating to other people and having motivation to stay engaged in relationships and things like that, is they'll say, fuck, how will I used to want to have a family. How am I going to have a family now?
Hmm.
I don't think I could ever get married now or have kids. And they might still feel like they're overall not regretting going down that path, but they're really struggling with that. And I think in some ways, like having regrets about it, that they never expected that would be something that would be taken away from them. And that's not going to happen to everyone, but it's very common and it completely makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
And
Totally.
I had started to recognize that too, that it would be very difficult for me to have children and be fully engaged in those relationships and that role.
Yeah.